A new front in the never-ending climate wars. Peter Dutton signals the coalition will scrap Australia's 2030 climate target. Labor says this means withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. But the two major parties agree on one thing. They've both blamed the Greens after attacks on politicians' offices over the war in Gaza. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The tension had been building for months, and on Wednesday it boiled over in Parliament. The Prime Minister turned on the Greens. He accused the party of spreading lies about the government's position on the war in Gaza, stirring up violent protesters and threatening social cohesion, all in an effort to chase votes. Peter Dutton joined in too. It was a bipartisan condemnation and a pivotal moment in this debate. Bandt denies inciting violence and is refusing to back down.
Balaclava-clad pro-Palestinian protesters have been systematically targeting government MPs' offices.
Enough is enough. It is unacceptable that misinformation is being consciously and deliberately spread by some Green senators and MPs.
Those who seek for their own political purposes and their own political advancement to pour fuel on this fire deserve condemnation of this chamber.
I will not be lectured to about peace and non-violence by people who back the invasion of Gaza.
All of us have a responsibility to prevent conflict in the Middle East from being used as a platform for prejudice here at home.
So please come and join them outside Prime Minister Albanese's office.
They made a series of outrageous accusations attempting to link the Greens to certain events that have happened at electorate offices.
The Greens leader Adam Bandt is threatening legal action against the Attorney-General over comments linking him to violence.
They have been encouraging criminal damage of MPs' electorate offices.
I think that the first law officer of this country should not make utterly unfounded statements and spread disinformation.
Adam Bandt, as lawyers, have written to the Attorney-General and are now investigating taking legal action.
I would prefer not to have to pursue these matters legally, and I hope the Attorney will respond in a proper way.
Prime Minister, given the anti-Semitic conduct of the Greens political party and the Prime Minister's justified condemnation of them yesterday, will the Prime Minister rule out governing with the support of the Greens?
We seek majority government. I said very clearly and consistently so.
I will not be lectured to about peace and non-violence from a Prime Minister and opposition leader who back the invasion of Gaza. Thanks very much.
We're also going to look this morning at the growing push to stop kids using social media. Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman has some strong views about the need for tougher action. Does the coalition want a ban? Well, he's our guest this morning. First, let's check what's making news. Israeli forces have rescued 4 hostages held in central Gaza, including 25-year-old Noah Argamani, who was famously filmed on the back of a motorbike after being captured by Hamas at a music festival on October 7. The Israeli Air Force heavily bombed the town of Nuseirat ahead of the rescue mission, with local health officials there claiming more than 200 Palestinians were killed. The New York Times reports the US provided intelligence on the hostages before the Israeli operation. The 9 newspapers focus on Peter Dutton rejecting Australia's 2030 climate target, with suggestions this would involve pumping an extra 2 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere by 2050 in breach of the Paris Agreement. And James Massola, meanwhile, says the coalition's nuclear policy will be unveiled in the next few weeks. Meanwhile, as the rollout of renewables faces some resistance in regional areas, the Sunday Age reports Victorians living near transmission lines will be able to seek one-off payments of up to $40,000 from the state government if the towers spoil their view. And finally, one on the housing crisis. The Sun Herald reports the New South Wales government is considering a levy on short-term holiday rentals and a cap on the number of days properties can be let out through sites like Airbnb. Well, we're going to begin this morning with the bipartisan condemnation of the Greens. There's no doubt many Australians are deeply concerned about what's happening in Gaza. But some of the Greens' efforts to pin blame on Labor has stretched the truth. Greens Senator David Shoebridge, for example, says defence contractor Vale Rafael Australia has been exporting critical parts for the Israeli Spike missile, which has been used in Gaza. Well, I've spoken to the company, which says that's just plain wrong. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Clare, Armstrong, John Kehoe and Claudia Long. Great to see you all. Look, I'll get to that argument over weapons sales, what we are selling to Israel or not. But just generally, Clare, the attacks that we saw on Labor MPs' offices, Adam Bandt insists he's never condoned violence. He's always said protests should be peaceful. But do the Greens bear any culpability for what we saw?
There's certainly concern, particularly among Labor MPs, that their Greens commentary is legitimising some of that behaviour. They obviously have repeatedly said that they support the blockading of offices. Obviously, that blockading is generally a peaceful activity, but within that context, there have been these, the damage on the offices, staff reporting being harassed and intimidated on their way to work. We know that a number of Labor MPs have had to shut their electorate offices, the Prime Minister included, since January. So in terms of a culpability for the Greens, I think it is difficult when they haven't necessarily been very clear about exactly what they expect to happen at these blockades. Yeah, and look, there's no doubt some of the language the Greens have used is being echoed at these protests, including the line that we've heard from Adam Bandt that Labor is complicit in genocide.
It is critical, Mr Speaker, that we debate this motion now because Labor is attempting to do anything to distract from their complicity in the unfolding genocide. Yeah, complicity in genocide. Claudia, you can understand why Labor's upset about that sort of thing.
Well, again, it's a pretty heavy accusation to make. And I mean, in terms of, I'm no lawyer, but in terms of an international human rights law point of view, I'm not really sure that that's a call that the Greens can be the ones to make. But also at the same time, I can see why Labor would be so, I think if there'd be people in the government who would be deeply hurt by that accusation. And the frustrating thing about this debate this week has really been whether it's what we've seen in Parliament or whether it's what we've heard with, for example, Peter Dutton calling Adam Bandt evil on radio. It feels so disconnected from what we're seeing happening in Palestine, what we're seeing, like, for example, the day that all of this happened, I opened up my phone, I went on social media and I saw a mother holding her dead child and it just feels so disconnected from that. And instead of bringing the community together and looking at what can the government be doing, what is Australia's role potentially in helping bring this kind of violence to an end, it just feels like we're more far apart than ever.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You end up with this sort of political point scoring going on. But look, what is said clearly can have impacts in terms of social cohesion and how people are reacting here in Australia. And we shouldn't have MPs having violent attacks on their offices and bricks thrown through windows and so on. The Greens, amongst the various things they've been saying, have been arguing that we've been selling weapons and weapons parts to Israel, including this from the Greens defence spokesperson, the Senator David Shoebridge, about the Israeli Spike missile. Have a listen to what he said on radio.
To Australia's shame, we continue to export weapons parts and weapons to Israel. In fact, something in the Newcastle region, there's a Vale Rafael, just north of Newcastle, exports some of the critical components for the Israeli Spike missile, which has been used to blow up apartment blocks.
Well, the Director of Government and Corporate Relations at Vale Group, Bob Baldwin, he's a former Member of Parliament, he told me Vale Rafael has been awarded a contract to supply the Spike missile system for the Australian Defence Force to protect its troops, its interests in our nation, nothing more. None have yet been manufactured, none. So that's just plain wrong. And there's also been the claims, well, it's certainly true that we contribute parts to the Joint Strike Fighter, and that, the Greens says, is something we should stop doing, or at least stop it being used by Israel. But some of these claims about an arms trade with Israel overstated? John?
It does appear the Greens are exaggerating a lot of this for political opportunism. Now, it is true that Australia does export a small amount of components for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter to America, which then makes these aeroplanes and exports them to 18 countries, including Israel. So, I mean, that's about...
And that happened well before October 7th.
Yeah, that's been happening for years.
Yeah.
It is interesting, though, that the Dutch government, for example, has suspended their exports of similar components. I mean,
the Dutch court ordered them to.
Yes, they ordered them to because on at an international level, and we haven't got time to get into the detail of this, obviously, but there are investigations that are ongoing into whether there is a genocide occurring. And instead, again, of having this kind of discussion and debate in Australia about what our role is potentially as a signatory to various conventions on that issue, we're instead having to talk about this kind of thing around what politicians are saying about one another, and it just feels so unproductive.
Yeah, but it does matter, though, what politicians say.
Certainly. Sorry, I didn't say it didn't matter.
But in the community, and, it can be a megaphone for people who have strong views to then take action. Bottom line, will the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader calling out the Greens this week, it's a dramatic moment, will it change much, though?
I don't think so. What I was going to say, just picking up on Claudia there, is there just has not really been a lot of nuance on every facet of this debate. And I know that sounds like an insane thing to say when we're talking about tens of thousands of people being killed in Palestine, women and children, when there are still hostages in the hands of Hamas. Nuance is a complex thing at the best of times, never, even worse when there's people dying. But the situation that we had on Wednesday, where there was this moment of joint condemnation of the Greens, the unity lasted about 10 seconds before Peter Dutton was up asking Labor to stop accepting Greens preferences. There's obviously going to be some pretty tight contests, Greens-Labor in some of those seats.
Labor's not going to put the Greens last in every seat, as Peter Dutton suggesting, are they?
I would be very surprised if that happened.
All right. Look, I want to move on to the other, it's kind of a developing story over the weekend. The comments Peter Dutton made to the Australian newspaper about the 2030 climate target. He thinks there's no way it's going to be achieved and therefore he's not going to support it. But, does that mean therefore pulling out of the Paris Agreement? I want to show you what the Coalition's Climate Change Energy Minister Angus Taylor had to say a few years back. This is when Labor was still working out in opposition its position on a 2030 target. And Angus Taylor was emphatic that a 2030 target was essential to be in the Paris Agreement.
You can't be in the Paris Agreement without a 2030 target. They are walking away from the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. That is their policy position. No 2030 target. That's where you end up.
So, now it's the Coalition in opposition. They're saying they don't like the 2030 target. It's a little unclear whether they'd set or try to set a different target. But Paris, the agreement's pretty clear, isn't it, John, that you can't water down the target. You certainly have to have a target, and every 5 years it's meant to increase.
Yeah, so we do require a 2030 target under the agreement, also a 2035 one by I think about next year as well. The line coming out of the Coalition in the last 24 hours is that actually we're just making the point that Labor is not going to reach its own 43% target. I think according to the government's own latest figures, it's going to hit about 42%, but I think there's some doubt about that now because the rollout of the renewables is not going well. One thing I'd ask, though, or sort of throw into the mix is if Donald Trump's elected President of the United States in November, then internationally that could throw a real spanner in the works of the Paris Agreement, and so that could be another sort of thing to throw into the mix.
Yeah,
as well.
it would certainly weaken the Paris Agreement if Trump comes back and withdraws the US, no doubt about that. But as to what the Coalition position is now, Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Minister, tried to clarify it yesterday.
Every single target Labor has set has failed. They will fail on the 43% emissions target by 2030. We will not associate ourselves with a Labor lie. We are committed to Paris, the 2050 net zero target.
So that's the only clear commitment there. They're still committed to net zero by 2050, Claire. Before that, 2030, 2035, 2040 is a little less clear.
Yeah, to say the least. I think one thing that's interesting about this is that there are parts of the Coalition party room who would rather there be no net zero by 2050 target at all. So obviously
Maybe the National Party parts of the Coalition?
A few members. But I think it's interesting because I don't necessarily think this announcement is going to fully appease that movement. So it's quite the compromise to make to not necessarily get the entire party room on a unity ticket on this issue. But broader than that, I think there's a problem where this is, it's not all about this, but the Paris Agreement and it's about international credibility. It's about message sent to investors. And even if you are still committed to net zero by 2050, if you don't have a credible pathway to get there, then that obviously throws into question the degree of your commitment to net zero. Now, obviously, Labor are not on target at the moment. They like to describe it as being within striking distance. It may sound like 1% is not far off, but in the scheme of emissions, it's quite a lot to cut back on in the next few years. So I think it's going to really come down to this debate about, do we aspire and get close, or do we set a more realistic target and meet it? And that's probably where the conflict is going to come out in this election.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, Claudia, politically, this might have been aimed at, and as John says, aimed at trying to put some heat on Labor over whether they're going to hit their own 2030 target. But it also puts up in flashing lights, doesn't it? What are the coalition going to do? I mean, they want to go nuclear and reckon that would, by 2050, get us to net zero. But there's a lot of time in between where it's a little unclear.
Yes, and I think if I were a Teal MP in a formerly Liberal seat this morning, I think I'd be pretty stoked, to be honest, because the main headline out of this, potentially for them, is Peter Dutton, Paris Accord, no more. Really, Paris Agreement, rather. It strikes me that this isn't really in line with the potential lessons they could have learned from the last election about why those seats are now in the hands of the Teals rather than the Liberals.
Yeah.
And it's going to be interesting, I think, to see the kind of impact this has going into the election.
Well, it's certainly what the government is suggesting as well. Time to talk now to the Liberal frontbencher David Coleman, the Shadow Communications Minister. To take us there, here was the Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, on the 2030 target.
The Paris Accord's very clear. You can't backslide. You can't reduce your commitments. So is Mr Dutton proposing to leave the Paris Accord, or is he just hoping no one notices? At the moment, the countries outside the Paris Accord are Libya, Yemen and Iran. Is Mr Dutton proposing to take Australia into that company? Did Mr Dutton take this extraordinary policy to his shadow cabinet or to his party room? Was his party consulted about leaving the Paris Accord?
David Coleman, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
So can you just clear this up for us? Will the coalition scrap Australia's 2030 climate target?
Well, what we've done is state the obvious, David, which is the 2030 target's not going to be met. It's not going to happen. And so what Peter Dutton is saying is the truth. If you look at the actual emissions under Labor, David, they have not declined. When the government came to office in June 2022, 108 million tonnes of emissions in that quarter. March 2024, 108 million tonnes of emissions. They're not on target to meet this forecast. And of course, this is the same guy, Chris Bowen, who forecast that electricity prices would come down by $275 per family. And so we're not going to just blindly accept a forecast that's obviously wrong.
Let's come back to the question, though. Will the coalition scrap the 2030 target?
Well, look, we'll have more to say about targets before the election, but
so
Peter Dutton
might have a different 2030 target.
Well, Peter Dutton made very clear on Saturday that that target is not going to be met, and we're not going to just, because Chris Bowen has named a target, say, well, that target is going to happen, because plainly it's not going to happen.
The department says it will, but just coming back to your position, you might still have a 2030 target.
Well, just to pull you up on that, the department doesn't say it will, David. It says that it will be missed, and it also says...
Well, it says 42% will be achieved.
Well, and it bases that on information that Chris Bowen has given to the department about policies that have not yet been implemented.
Okay. But what about just this question? Will you have a 2030 target?
Well, look, as I said, we'll make all of our policies very clear well in advance of the election. We are absolutely committed to net zero by 2050.
So this
it's
is a
incredibly
little confusing.
important.
You might have, it sounds like you're saying you're leaving open the prospect of having a 2030 target.
Well, David, we will make all of our policies very clear in relation to emissions. We are absolutely committed to the net zero target by 2050. We are absolutely committed to the Paris Agreement. But we're not going to maintain a Chris Bowen fantasy when it's plainly not going to happen. Why would we do that?
Has the party room even discussed this?
Well, look, I'm not going to go into our internal party room discussions, David. But
sort of thing you should discuss, though, right?
Well, look, what Peter Dutton said, David, is Chris Bowen is not going to meet the target that he set. That is true. And what's the counterfactual, David? Is Peter Dutton and the coalition supposed to maintain a Chris Bowen fantasy because it's convenient for Chris Bowen?
Well, at least tell us whether you think we should have a target at all. Would be a starting point, wouldn't it?
Well, again, David, we'll make all of our targets very clear prior to the election. We are very committed to net zero and to Paris, the Paris Agreement.
So you want to stay in Paris?
We absolutely are committed to the Paris Agreement.
The agreement says you can't water down targets. You do need to have a 2030 and a 2035 target.
Well, David, the question on the 2030 target is really one for Chris Bowen. He's the one who's parading around a target that is not going to happen. There have been basically no emissions reductions in the 2 years that Labor has been in office, which I would have thought was a pretty pertinent fact if we're talking about emissions reductions.
All right, I'll move on, but just to be clear, you reckon you can stay in the Paris Agreement maybe without a 2030 target?
We're committed to the Paris Agreement, we're committed to net zero by 2050, and we'll have more to say about targets well in advance of the election.
Let's turn to social media. The e-Safety Commissioner dropped the case against X during the week. This was in relation to the video about the Wakely stabbing and whether it should have been taken down from the Twitter servers globally. The case is now done. From a policy perspective, this is still a bit of a question. Should the Commissioner, the e-Safety Commissioner in Australia, have the power to order social media companies to remove content globally?
Well, look, what the Commissioner was really doing is saying that the easiest way to remove material for Australians is simply to delete it. The Act is very clear. It's for Australian users, not global users. And so what the court case was effectively about is how do you define an Australian user online? And that's what the interim judgment was about. But the Commissioner has had pretty much all the other platforms deleted the material, and she wanted to test that in court.
But she also said this week, now able to talk about it, Julian Grant, the Commissioner, said that when the coalition government gave her the powers, it was very clear, it was in a press release, she said, the power to order content be removed wherever it's hosted, and they're usually hosted in the United States. So she says that's what you guys told her to do.
Yeah, no, and she's right. And I don't think that's not in dispute, David. So the Act is very clear that the Commissioner's orders can apply to remove content that's hosted overseas.
Right, because it's confusing. Peter Dutton said when she did this that you can't influence what happens elsewhere in the world. I think it's silly to try that.
They're separate issues, David. So the servers are located overseas, but what the Act is about is Australian users. So in order to stop the content from being seen by Australian users, you've got to take action on those overseas servers. And actually, X didn't dispute that. Right. What X disputed was should that apply to users who are outside of Australia. And that's what the court case was about. And Peter was just stating the obvious, that just as we wouldn't want Romania to regulate for our internet, we can't regulate for Romania. And the Commissioner's not saying that she wants to do that. It was just a debate about how you define an Australian user online.
Do you think the Commissioner's confused about her powers here?
No, I think the Commissioner does a great job.
So she wasn't silly to try and do this?
Well, look, again, David, she was simply testing the legal issue around the definition of an Australian user. She wasn't seeking to claim global domain over the internet. And we appointed Julian Grant, and of course she was pursuing laws under the Online Safety Act, the world-leading Online Safety Act that the Coalition put in place.
More broadly on social media, you do have great concerns about the impact that it's having, particularly on young people. Just explain to me what your concerns are and what needs to be done.
Yeah, David, I think this is one of the defining issues of our era. I think that the mental health of Australian kids is being massively damaged by social media. If you look at things like the self-harm hospitalisation rates of girls, it's a heavy topic, David, but we should talk about it, up dramatically in the last decade. There's no question in my mind that social media is playing a part in that. And the social media companies basically don't do anything about it, is the bottom line. And so what we need to do is put in place a system of age verification where we basically say, if you're under this age, you shouldn't be on social media, and we put the onus on the social media companies to actually enforce that as opposed to what they do now, which is pretty much nothing.
And so, I mean, we can come to technically how that would work, but in principle, you're saying what age should kids not be on social media?
Yeah, well, look, we've said we don't really see why kids under 16 need to be on social media, but we'll have more to say about that in the future.
But is it fair to say that the coalition is essentially arguing kids under 16 you would like to ban from social media?
Well, look, we've said we don't see why kids under 16 should be on social media, David. Different people have different views on the age. But bottom line is, little kids should not be on social media. We still have a classification system. We still have R-rated movies. Nobody says, hey, let's show a R-rated movie to a 10-year-old. And yet on social media, they see worse things every day. And imagine, David, if we went back 20 years and we said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create an environment where kids can interact with any adult on earth who can show them whatever they want, and we're going to be okay with that. We would have said that's absurd, and it's time to take action on that.
Clearly, a lot of parents would agree. How you do it, though, this age verification technology now being trialled, just give us a sense of where you would like to get to with this in terms of making it legally enforceable.
Yeah, well, look, on the trial, so we put legislation to Parliament in November to get started on trialling this. The government came into the Parliament and voted against it. They put 6 months later, they changed their mind. But what's happening with this trial now, David, is social media companies are not required to actually do anything in the trial, which is absurd. So what should be happening is the government should be saying to the social media companies, under the trial, you need at your front door, when kids try to sign up, you need a process of age verification. Now, if the government needs further powers or laws to do that, we'll wave them through. But what they're saying at the moment is the trial won't require the social media companies to do anything, which is plainly absurd. So that's what we want to see.
And of course, plenty of people point out that kids are pretty clever with technology, whether it's VPNs or whatever. There are ways to get around the technology, ways for them to still use social media.
Well, it's true that people will try to get around whatever law you put in place, David, but that's true of just about every law. We don't say, some people might try and, traffic illegal material, so therefore we won't have a law to stop it. So we have to say, what do we want as a society? And what we should want as a society is to protect kids from the immense damage that's being done to them through social media. So that's the first point. So we should all come together and say, we're going to do this. And then you get into the implementation questions. And will someone try to get around it? Yeah, they will. But that is not a reason not to do it.
And if not enough is done over the next little while before the election, you'll go to the election saying, we want to ban kids under 16 from social media.
Well, look, we think it is self-evident that action needs to be taken here. The government has, frankly, been well behind the 8 ball here. There's been a lot of campaigning from the coalition in the community. I met last week with some families of people who are advocating this change, and many of whom have been through the most tragic of circumstances. And we've got to get this done, and the government is moving too slowly. It shouldn't be a partisan thing, it's just self-evident, but we should just get on and do it.
Let me turn to a couple of other issues. Your seat of Banks in Sydney has one of the highest, if not the highest, proportion of people with Chinese ancestry. I think it's something like 20%. In your inaugural speech in Parliament, you said Australia made its national foundations stronger by allowing more people to build upon them. Are you comfortable with your party's plans to dramatically slash immigration?
I'm very comfortable with those plans, David. We have to cut immigration because the government completely lost control of it. 920,000 people in 2 years, and during the period got the forecasts wrong by literally hundreds of thousands. My experience, David, is that people, regardless of their background, in many cases, particularly people of multicultural backgrounds who have moved to Australia, everyone wants an orderly system. Everyone wants an immigration system where if you play by the rules, if you work hard, you're rewarded. But people don't want a random system that's out of control, and that's what we've got at the moment.
And does the plan involve cutting family reunion visas by 25% as well?
Well, look, we'll put forward all those numbers down the track. Obviously, as you know...
You're not sure at the moment, or...?
Well, David, as you know, the government hasn't said for itself for the future...
No, I'm asking about your policy. Is it to cut family reunion visas?
Well, look, as Dan Ilic said previously, David, we'll review the economic situation when we come to government, and we'll make appropriate decisions at that time. And
How
the government
would that go down in your seat?
Well, I think, again, David, people are sensible, in my experience, about migration. They want an orderly system. They want someone in charge who's actually got their hands on the levers, and not someone who's just, frankly, losing control which is what's happened under this government.
Final issue, the Immigration Minister's issued a new direction 110, as to when you can cancel someone's visa. Peter Dutton says any non-citizen who's committed a serious offence should be kicked out. What if they have children in Australia, though? Should that be taken into consideration?
Well, again, David, I mean, the bottom line here is that Andrew Giles has let criminals stay in Australia deliberately. So the whole purpose of Direction 99 was to ensure that people who would other go to New Zealand don't. New Zealand said, please keep your criminals in Australia, and Australia said, where do I sign? Which was extraordinary. And what Peter's saying is, of course, we want to drive down to zero the number of criminals who are staying in Australia, because plainly that's not in Australia's interest.
Well, you had a ministerial direction when you were Immigration Minister as well. This was Direction 79, and it said decision makers must make a determination about whether cancellation is or is not in the best interests of the child. And that was a primary consideration in your direction. It was then used to let various people stay in Australia, including the disgraced former basketball star Kendall Pinder. He was convicted of various sexual assaults. The AAT let him stay in Australia. He went on to rape again. He pleaded guilty to 2 more rapes. Andrew Giles finally cancelled his visa a few months ago. Why didn't you cancel his visa?
Well, David, and obviously I'm not familiar with that particular case.
Made a lot of headlines.
Well, what I did in Direction 79, David, that you just referred to, is actually strengthen the system by increasing the emphasis on crimes related to violence against women and children. So I strengthened the system.
Yeah, but you also said their kids should be a primary consideration. If they've got kids here, that needs to be a primary consideration.
Well, and that's been a consideration in the system for a very long time, David. But
it let a sex offender stay, and he went on to re-offend. So do you take responsibility for that?
Well, David, what I did was strengthen the system in Direction 79. It was stronger than previous directions. What Andrew Giles did was explicitly weaken the system.
No, but I'm asking about your direction, which the AAT cited in a number of cases. I've got one here of a heroin trafficker as well, allowed to stay, citing your Direction 79. Do you not take responsibility for that?
Well, David, again, I'm not familiar with the specific examples.
Your direction.
Well, I'm not familiar with the specific cases you're referring to, but Direction 79 was stronger than the directions that preceded it. Direction 99 was deliberately weaker than the directions that preceded it.
Because you're not aware of this case, Kendall Pinder, you can Google him, you're not taking responsibility?
Well, David, there are obviously large numbers of cases that go through the system every year. And what you do as a minister, and what I did as a minister, was seek to strengthen the system, was seek to make it harder.
This guy was
for
allowed
criminals
to stay. Andrew Giles had to kick him out.
Well, David, again, what I did was make the system stronger. There are always constitutional and legal reasons that affect particular cases. Well, I don't agree with that at all, David, because I made it stronger. That's the decision I made. The decision Andrew Giles made was, how do we ensure that people who would otherwise go back to New Zealand get to stay in Australia? And that was a shameful decision. And that's why he sought to reverse it in Direction 110, but he still kept the connection to the Australian community as a primary consideration, which is the whole problem with Direction 99 in the first place. These guys have no idea how to manage the immigration system, and that's why we've seen such terrible results.
David Coleman, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
Well, coming up, we will look a little closer at that new Direction 110 issued on Friday. First, let's continue this conversation back to our panel, Clare Armstrong, John Kehoe and Claudia Long. Just on social media there, Clare, it seems a little clearer now from the coalition they are going to go for an effective ban on kids under 16 from social media. I mean, we can get to how achievable that is technically, but that's quite a strong position.
It's one that I think has an increasing amount of community backing. There are petitions online at the moment that have tens of thousands of signatures. I met with the same parents that David Coleman was talking about when they were in Parliament last week, and they have awful stories of children that have self-harmed, that are suffering eating disorders, and a whole range of really awful consequences that their parents say they can really directly connect to the outcomes or to social media. So I don't think that the coalition is going to find too many critics if they do instate something like this.
And in South Australia, Labor Premier Peter Malinauskas is heading down this path as well. So there is momentum behind this.
Florida has legislated it too. It's happening globally. Yeah.
I think, like Claire says, you know, it's hard to push back on this when you see some of the evidence around the harms that young people are suffering around social media. And I think, you know, for parents, I'm not a parent myself, but as a former child who, teenager who went on social media, one of the main arguments I made to my parents was, oh, Mum, all my friends are on it and they're all talking without me. Sorry, Mum. And so I think that could potentially help parents as well, kind of, you know, I guess band together a little bit, have a bit more of an opportunity to say, well, not everyone's on it because it's illegal. It's sort of a hard one to push back against.
I mean, John, you and I are parents. You grapple with these things as all parents do, but it probably would strengthen your argument as a parent, wouldn't it, to be able to say it's against the law, get off.
Definitely, and I think there'd be a fair bit of support about amongst the parenthood out there, actually, because it is a real toxic, insidious influence on young people. And I think people are now realising the longer you can keep young people and children off social media, probably the better.
Yeah.
There's a class action going on in the States at the moment, a bunch of US states taking on Meta, and some of the evidence that they've been able to glean through requiring production of documents is actually exposing for the first time that it's not an accidental, unfortunate thing that children get hooked on social media. By design, these platforms chase after teenagers because they know that they chase that dopamine reward. They, for example, Meta once trialled stopping sending notifications to young people during school hours or after 11 p.m. They found in their trial that there was a reduction in anxiety and stress and a bunch of other issues. Overall user time on the platform went down by 1%, so they never did anything with it.
Interesting. Let's move on to the economy. We saw some very weak growth during the week, barely any growth at all. This is for the first 3 months of the year, 0.1% growth. John, you described this as the Goldilocks scenario, though. Why?
Look, it might seem counterintuitive, and sure, we'd want faster economic growth in normal circumstances, but I think given the high inflation problem Australia still has, we're trying to rid ourselves of that. To have a slightly positive growth figure without recession headlines, but at the same time having weak growth that we need to get inflation down is not a bad outcome. Now, we do still have 5 negative quarters of per person GDP, so people are feeling it at the individual level, but we also need to keep things in perspective. Unemployment's still pretty low, 4.1%. And the thing that's hurting households more than anything else, I know we focus on interest rates, that's certainly part of the pain, but it's inflation. As Michelle Bullock, the RBA governor, said this week, every household feels that, and it's particularly bad for poor people.
And I'll tell you how they're feeling it, and you can look at it in this chart here. The numbers during the week also showed us that our household savings are actually worse than we'd previously thought. Obviously, we saved a lot during COVID, as you can see with the spike there, and then it's come off. And look at the end of the line, really steep plunge. People are just eating into what's left of their savings.
Yeah, I think household savings are at about a 15-year low, so still slightly saving, but not as much. And one of the reasons we've discovered is there was a revision to the Australian Bureau of Statistics data to show actually last year people were spending more, particularly on travel and overseas, than we previously realised. So consumption was a bit stronger than we realised, and this sort of poses an interesting challenge or dilemma now for the Reserve Bank, because when the July 1 tax cuts kick in, there's this question now, because we're actually spending more and saving less last year than we realised, does that mean more of the tax cuts are going to be spent? And what does that mean for consumer spending and inflation in the economy as well?
Well, we'll see. But right now, certainly the Treasurer reckons that figure that we saw for the first 3 months, the very weak growth, justifies what he did in the budget.
Frankly, we got a lot of free advice over the course of the last couple of months, and if we'd followed that advice to slash and burn in the budget with this kind of scorched earth austerity to take even more heat out of the economy, we now know that would be absolutely diabolical given the context and the conditions that we confront.
Yeah, does it justify the budget, do you think, Claire?
Well, I suppose in the sense that there's now going to be this really weak period of the economy and that you do actually want to give Australians a bit of support where you can. Whether it justifies, for example, the energy bill relief shifting from being quite targeted to the lowest income households in Australia to being more broad scale at the same time as that there's the tax cuts obviously starting to flow, is, I think, as John says, a question.
Well, just on that $300, this was the feature, one of the features of the budget. We spent a lot of time talking about whether it's going to be inflationary or not. The Treasurer argued it would put downward pressure on inflation because you're lowering the price of electricity. The Reserve Bank Governor, we heard from her during the week on this.
We try to look through things that are one-off and are going to be reversed. But in terms of the underlying pulse of inflation, we're looking through that to the underlying, the trim mean, if you like, and we don't think it's going to have an impact on that.
Yeah, so what does that really mean? That $300 isn't going to change the Reserve Bank's thinking at all when it comes to interest rates?
Well, it doesn't sound like it particularly. I mean, and like John has sort of said this week, and a number of others have said too, this is a Goldilocks scenario, but it's going to be a fine balancing act for the next little while by the sounds of things. It's going to be a tricky one to pull off. And I think the government potentially has a big challenge coming in how they're going to say, you know, to Australian voters, to the Australian electorate, you have to go through this pain. It's going to be worth it. It'll make things better in the long run.
It needs to get
we need to kind of because otherwise, and we've been talking a bit about social cohesion today. You have to kind of say we're all in this together. The pain is worth it. But how are you going to sell that message? Potentially could be a real challenge.
One turn to the NDIS. We heard from the head of the integrity unit during the week with some pretty disturbing claims about fraud in the system.
I have spoken to very recently a participant who would meet the provider at the ATM. The provider would withdraw cash and provide that cash to the participant for her to source illicit substances.
So he talked about NDIS money being used for buying drugs, cars, holidays. Claudia, what's going on here? Is there much detail about this level of fraud?
So we haven't got a heap of detail on specifically the specific instances and numbers on this, and it's something that senators have asked for on notice. So we've had Senate estimates over the last 2 weeks, and essentially that's when senators get to grill folks like John Dardo from various agencies, and they can bring back a bit more detail a couple of weeks later. So it'd be interesting to get a bit more explicit detail on what exactly he means and the extent of that within the NDIS. But some of the stuff that came out of estimates was horrifying. This is disgusting stuff.
How does that work? I mean, what he's referring to there, money being used to purchase drugs, how does the system even allow that to happen?
Well, I think that's one of the questions that's really still up in the air, because as any NDIS participant can tell you, it's not easy to just get money from the NDIS. It's a complicated process that obviously there's still some loopholes, clearly, because people, and I think it's really important too to say that these are not you know, actual proper providers. These are criminals who are using this system to exploit people with a disability and to take advantage of them and to take their money that could have been used to care for them.
Yeah. The problem is there's more than 170,000 unregistered providers for the NDIS. As one NDIS employer said to me during the week, you could get out of jail tomorrow, set up an ABN and suddenly become a service provider under the NDIS.
And this is now
and
what
it's just not regulated.
No, and this is what they're trying to fix, isn't it, by saying they have to be regulated providers, but they're still working through how to do that.
Yeah, there's this constant tension with the system, because obviously you're dealing with a group of people that are incredibly vulnerable who have been repeatedly let down by government. It's why things like co-design throughout this process are going to be so important, because you want the people who need this service to maintain faith and trust in the system. The problem is, as is well canvassed, that in the rush to onboard and get this system up and running, which does a lot of good for a lot of people, it happen in a way that there hasn't been maybe the level of regulation that should be required for an agency or a part of the budget that spends this much money.
And certainly the view amongst Greens too is that all of this focus on fraud is a smokescreen for the cuts that they reckon are coming. And it's interesting, Bill Shorten, every time he talks about the NDIS fraud, he always says this.
I just say to people listening to you, listening to this, the scheme's here to stay. Our changes are not about evicting a whole lot of people.
So, Claudia, he's really trying to give that assurance, isn't he?
Yeah, and I think, you know, like, as Claire mentioned, like this is a system that has co-design is a really important part of that, and what that means is working with the disability community to ensure that they are the ones helping design this system and the changes to it. And NDIS participants and the disability community, there is a reason that there is a lack of trust in government. It is because of things that have not been co-designed in the past that have had really dire consequences for people. And I think for Bill Shorten, his challenge, and this is why he regularly mentions that, is to show that that isn't a risk this time around. And it's been interesting because we've had a Senate inquiry going on into the government's bill with changes to the NDIS that's currently before the Parliament. And one of the resounding really messages out of it from disability groups is that there needs to be changes to this for various reasons that, you know, probably too complicated for us to go into now. And it's a tricky one too, because on registration, there is absolutely an argument that registration is needed because it protects people. But for many participants at the moment, they're really scared that they're going to lose people that they trust to come into their homes and care for them. And it is a really kind of nuanced and tricky thing to navigate for that reason. And this is why co-design is so important, to have everyone at the table working on this together.
Yeah, and to get the states to step up the foundational supports they're meant to provide.
Yeah,
which
they've
hasn't
said
seen a lot of movement.
Yeah.
Well, you know, having spoken to some of the states recently, I mean, they're backing away from supporting the feds changing this, and the government's put up a bit more money for the education system in the states to try and shift some people or future people who have got lower levels of disability, like learning disabilities or maybe autism and these sorts of things. But the states are now starting to push back on this because they've cost shifted a lot of this to the Commonwealth over the last decade, and they don't want to take the cost back.
Pick up the tab again. Look, final one, the Immigration Minister's new Direction 110 to replace Direction 99. Andrew Giles says this will make it clear that community safety is the #1 issue before cancelling or deciding whether to cancel a visa.
This direction is clearer. We are elevating community safety as a key principle. We are also, as I've said, put in place a higher level of consideration on the impact of victims and their families. These are clear, crystal clear directions to decision makers about the expectations that I have, that the Australian government has and the Australian community has about non-citizens.
Claire, we heard from David Coleman, the opposition doesn't think it goes far enough, but it is clearly different to 99, Direction 99.
Yes, it definitely puts that emphasis back on community safety. I think what we've learned throughout this Direction 99 saga, and that you very clearly got to there with Coleman on his own direction, is that intent is one thing and interpretation and outcome is another.
By the administrative.
There was never a world in which Andrew Giles, when he issued Direction 99, fully foresaw or expected the kinds of people that were non-citizens that were allowed to stay in Australia. That would be how the AAT interpreted that. So I actually think, you know, it's kind of premature on both sides to say this either will or won't work, because none of them are the lawyers or the people in these review bodies making these decisions.
Look, hopefully someone's going to keep an eye on how this plays out, because part of the problem in 99 was they weren't aware, the department wasn't telling the minister how these cases were playing out. And it sounds from David Coleman like he wasn't aware either of how his direction was playing out, letting a rapist in this case stay in the country.
Yes, I think so. Immigration ministers have a huge amount of ministerial discretion. In fact, one of the reasons they're often, like even Giles right now, quite reticent to talk about specific cases is because they're the most litigated person in government. Thousands of cases, specifically naming them, because of that discretion that they have. Clearly there was a breakdown, and maybe has always been a bit of a breakdown in communication, when the government's expectation is X, the result ends up being Y, and that is not properly, effectively communicated.
How's this gone down with New Zealand, though? They're not thrilled with Direction 110 by the sounds of it?
Yeah, the Prime Minister there, Christopher Luxon, is a little unimpressed at the prospect that people with a New Zealand citizenship who have committed crimes in Australia may be shipped back to New Zealand. But I think he also did make the point that the government does have the right to make the laws as well.
Sure, but this is more difficult than the black and white that we often hear, because there are people who may be a New Zealand citizen, but they have spent their whole life here. They might have kids here. Sure, they've done bad stuff, served their time in jail. Should they be sent back? What does that mean for the kids? It's not straightforward in every case.
No, it's complicated. And yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky one because, like Claire said, you know, you can write all the directions you like, but how that's interpreted in real life is, you know, tricky and complicated. I found it interesting too when you were chatting to the Shadow Minister Coleman about that direction that he issued. 79. And we've heard from the opposition that they've been asking, you know, Giles to apologise. Are they going to ask their colleague to do the same?
Didn't sound like it.
I was just going to say, on the New Zealand thing, the issue is you have to be country agnostic in this system. And I'm sure as much as there's a bit of an understanding that this special relationship between Australia and New Zealand, you can't isolate New Zealand citizens and treat them differently to other non-citizens.
Look, Andrew Giles, he still won't accept that Direction 99 was a mistake, even though it's clearly now being replaced. I did speak on the Insiders podcast this week to Mike Bizzullo and Sam Roggeveen. We were talking about the threats Australia faces, how worried we should be about China and so on. Two very different perspectives, really fascinating chat with the two of them about defence primarily. But Mike Bizzullo, of course, former Home Affairs Secretary. He was Secretary when Direction 99 was being put together and implemented, and I couldn't help ask him for his thoughts at the time on this.
Very dear friend of mine, Dennis Richardson, served for many years as a Deputy Secretary of Immigration. The best advice he ever gave me when I started as the Secretary of Immigration in 2014 was, Mike, just understand in immigration, whatever you try to fix over here, it's such a complicated act and a complex system, whatever you do over here is going to have a bunch of consequences over there. So you've got to be really careful.
Was that advice heeded on this one?
I'm not going to say that. I'm just applying the Richardson rule.
Right.
If you pull a thread over here, something perverse will happen over there.
Something perverse will happen over there. You can listen to that full podcast chat. As I say, primarily it's about national security. The QR codes are there on screen. But I think we get what he's suggesting there, that making this change with Direction 99 did have a consequence. So maybe the department wasn't thrilled about it at the time. Anyway, I'm sure we will talk about ministerial directions for some time to come. Time now for Talking Pictures. Claudia Long, John Kehoe, Clare Armstrong. We'll be back very shortly with some final observations. But here's Mike Bowers.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with investigative humorist and the host of A Rational Fear, the one and only Dan Ilic, and a very warm welcome.
Oh, thank you. I feel so warm on this extremely cold winter's day.
Dan, back in '92, Bill Clinton made the observation that it's the economy stupid, but for Australia in 2024, it's more like it's the stupid economy.
Yeah, I feel it. I absolutely feel it.
Andrew Dyson, this lovely national accounts figure, if growth was the heartbeat of a nation, Dan, then I think we need the defibrillator.
Oh my gosh, yeah, 0.1% growth.
Barely there.
Yeah.
Barely there.
As someone who is 5'6", I would kill for 0.1% growth, yeah.
It looks like this economic kangaroo might have an eating disorder, per capita recession here. Very, very skinny.
You know what's sad? Thanks to high interest rates, Joeys are staying in the pouch well into their 30s.
Yeah. They're never going to be able to afford their own pouch.
No, never.
Lovely Matt Golding cartoon.
Yeah, really, 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 really weak growth.
Yeah, don't mention the R word.
And what is the R word?
Well, that would be recession.
Oh, bless you.
This Brett Lethbridge cartoon, Dan. Here is Jim, in fact, on the Australian economy wagon with the RBA governor. I do love a blunderbuss in a cartoon. And
yeah.
I think she's shot the Australian economy horse here.
When she should have been shooting the inflation dragon.
Yeah.
I think the problem here is Jim Chalmers took a horse and cart when he should have taken a bullet train.
Fiona Katauskas has a lovely take on this.
People need to spend less money and lose more jobs.
Everyone thinks he's an insensitive jerk, but he's actually an economist for the RBA. Insensitive jerk consultants.
Look, it's good work if you can get it and maintain it. I like this here. He's actually not drinking red wine, he's actually drinking the Kool-Aid.
There wasn't too many smiles for Andrew Giles this week as the immigration remained a very hot Dutton topic.
Yeah, that's right.
Dan, this David Rowe cartoon.
I love this. This is like an apocalypse now of the future. It feels very, very good to me. And what I love about it is how Dutton is droning everywhere. You can't escape him.
Yeah, I love the way he sort of captured the very arachnid look on him.
He's got a Terminator eye.
Yeah, yeah, and he's cyan sort of blue, but lovely four-poster bed. It's a four-boaster bed, I think. With Dutton's on the...
Yeah, I think the great thing about Dutton is actually you can actually hear the drone in his voice.
Yeah,
Morning, Giles.
Morning, Giles.
Morning, Giles.
I love this Johannes Leek cartoon. Best immigration minister we've ever had.
Oh, where is this character from? Oh my God, it's hard to tell.
New Zealand News. Giles keeps scores of violent Kiwi crims in Australia.
Yeah, Johannes Leek giving me a good belly laugh today.
Alan Moyer seems to think that Peter Dutton taking aim at Giles with his, I think it's a BS gun by the look of it, has sort of done the boomerang on him.
Yeah, it's a cannon powered by bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, earlier in the week there were rumours that Mr Frydenberg was going to make a return to politics, but apparently he was just joshing.
Very good.
Peter Brolman's picked up on Josh's non-return to politics.
The thing about renewables is they do return.
Yeah.
And I honestly think that Josh is really good at wind generation.
Yeah, hot air. I did love this Matt Golding take on Charlie Brown. He's got the kite flyers with Hamer here saying, oh, good grief, Charlie Brown. The kite's got caught here.
Yes, in a Monique Ryan tree.
Yes.
Do you know the actual Latin name for that tree?
No.
I believe it's Slimmus chances.
Perfectly named.
Yep.
Kathy Wilcox has a lovely take. Balloons are nearly always disappointing. It's such a beautiful metaphor for politicians, isn't it? Full of hot air.
Absolutely, and it's such a beautiful, simple cartoon.
Yeah.
I saw in the letter section of a newspaper somebody wrote Schadenfreudenberg. I thought that was stunning.
Dan, this week the NAC decided it wasn't going to take any further action on Robodebt, and John Kudelka's got this lovely cartoon with Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, bringing the little teeny NAC dog here to heel. There's a good boy.
There's a good boy. I do enjoy that Kudelka has not only put Albo in a Radio Birdman t-shirt, but is also carrying a little baggie of NAC poo. Of course, the people who are most invested in this investigation, or potential investigation, are also in this cartoon, buried.
Yeah, exactly. Dan, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David Spears.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Claudia.
So my final observation is that obviously domestic violence, sexual violence and family violence have been in the news a fair bit lately, but you get the sense that that's starting to drop away again. Interestingly, this week we got a review of the New South Wales Police Force responses to domestic and family violence, and it was really damning, I think. It was by the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, and it found 171 breaches of their own policies in responding to domestic and family violence, things like failure to protect at-risk kids, failure to take away guns, and failure to implement, apprehended violence orders. So this is the sort of stuff we really need to keep an eye on while we keep looking at this issue.
John.
David, I think this week's revelations about the multi-billion-dollar blowout in the waste and the fraud of the NDIS really demonstrates we have a culture in Canberra that doesn't respect taxpayers enough. Now, this was evident under the Gillard government when they brought a very loose NDIS in, didn't budget for it properly. The mentality continued under the coalition, a six-fold blowout in the Snowy Hydro to $12 billion, a $50 billion GST deal for WA paid for by federal taxpayers. And frankly, it's continuing now. Government spending as a share of the economy is going to hit the highest since the 1980s outside of the pandemic. This is all going to have to be paid for by working age, wage and salary earners who are going to pay higher and higher average tax rates, more and more bracket creep. These are some of the same people who can't afford to buy a home. And I just think nobody in Canberra seems to want to do anything about it.
Claire.
Claudia and I are of one mind. According to the not-for-profit Counting Dead Women Australia, there's now 35 women that have been killed in Australia this year in intimate family violence. We heard in estimates last week just 67 of the frontline domestic violence workers of the roughly 350 due to be in place by the end of this month are actually on the ground. States are blaming the Commonwealth blaming the states. There's no workers there. That obviously needs to be dealt with.
Well, I'm glad you've both given that a bit of focus at the end of the show today. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, Jane Hume won our Matt Price Award for the funniest moment last year, and look, she's giving it another red-hot go this year after a revealing exchange with the chair of ASIC during a Senate estimates hearing. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
I feel this is very awkward. Every time I see Mr Longo now, it seems to be at the gym on Saturday mornings. So I apologise for the lycra. But that's all right.
These are yours.
Less worthy men have seen me in far less. So.
I want to reassure the committee that I will never be seen in lycra.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.